Charles Neve from Education Changemakers, and today we're going to look at using positive language and the importance of positive language in the classroom and some practical strategies about how to develop our skills around using positive language. We always start with a dedication, and that is to the Indigenous owners of our country and the tremendous contribution that they have made over the last 40 to 60,000 years, and paying respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So, positive language. I'm sure it's one of those things where all teachers sort of sit down and think to themselves, well, yeah, of course I should be positive, but then we find ourselves often, when challenged by really negative behaviors, we find ourselves dragged down that journey into using pretty negative language with some of our students. So today I'd like to look at how that language does in fact affect our learning environment. And I'd also like to get across to you how to understand some ways to ensure that your language is more positive and therefore more effective, both in creating good relationships between staff and students. We know that's a core to having a happy and effective school, but also in creating good learning, because that learning is always linked to language as well. So if you're watching this with a group, take this moment, just 3 minutes or so, to sit back and have a little discussion about language at the school now. I know at James, me and Con had a chat to you about conversations a few weeks ago now, and language was very much central to that conversation. So I'm just wondering if you've reflected on it even more over the last few weeks. Perhaps you've picked yourself up saying certain things in the class, maybe things that you thought, oh, maybe I shouldn't say that going forward. Maybe you've noticed the kids talking in a particular way as well, which you don't feel comfortable with. So just have a little chat to your group now. Press pause on the video and have a chat about how you're using language at the moment with your students. Great, so what the research says about language is this, and it's pretty clear, it's pretty unequivocal. Language affects students' identities. It affects how they see themselves. So as soon as you start talking in a way that perhaps is undermining their identity as a human being, you'll start to see a really negative reaction. So it's really important that we focus on that. How is the language that I am using affecting the identity of this student in front of me right now? Language also shapes the way students behave. Obviously, they copy what we model for them. I know I certainly see this with my own kids. You'll tell a kid not to speak in a certain way, and then you'll realize actually he's just sort of been modeling what you've been doing. And that works at home, but it also works in the playground and at school. So however we model behavior, it's very likely that they're going to copy that behavior. And obviously it shapes our relationships with students. If we talk in a particular way, if we're undermining their identity, or if we're perhaps modeling negative behaviors and language, then we're going to be undermining the relationships that we're having with our students. And so much research, especially over the last decade or so, has shown the importance of relationships to actual learning. Yes, it's important to behavior and engagement, but to learning. Students with positive relationships with their teachers actually learn better. So language is at the center of all of those sorts of questions. Positive language equals positive behavior, and student engagement is pretty much what all the research is saying in this area. This is a little video I found on YouTube. You can find it yourself. I'll show it to you in a minute, but it's about a school in Chicago, about some of the strategies they used for when they were in a pretty difficult situation in terms of the behavior of their students and the culture at the school. And it was all focused around this idea of language.
About a year to 2 years ago, the teachers, the administration felt that the students were taking basically charge of the halls. We had our guys outside of their lockers, what the kids call posting up, or hanging 15 to 20 minutes after the bell. It seemed like every period there was a fight. We have about 12 security guards for 2,700 students. So you could just imagine how much time and effort was put just to have those kids funneled into classes. Our ACT scores took a dip the last 2 years. We attributed that to the fact that the kids were not going to class. They weren't taking the advantage of those 46 minutes. And the reason why is because there was no supervision.
All right, happy Friday, everybody. Make sure you have those IDs on.
And the teachers felt that it was time for us to make a change.
Troy, how's it going? Good to see you. Good to see you.
There's a variety of strategies that we use to help schools define and structure their learning environment. So positive behavior supports is a really broad term for different strategies that we use to really intentionally design and deliver instruction in ways that really motivate kids to be engaged in instruction and to demonstrate the kind of positive behaviors that we would like to see from them as learners. So Kelly implemented our foundation strategy, which is one of our school climate strategies, for what they expect of adults and students in their common areas.
And we said, we got it. We know what we want to do. We want to do the Start on Time initiative.
All right, guys, we only got about a minute left. Let's get to class quickly.
You can do it. You can do it.
All right, 15 seconds. We got to have the hall clear. 15 seconds.
We made some changes. Their mentality now is like, I need to make it to class on time.
Okay, you can walk her down. Thank you.
Once the bell rings, the second group of teachers are our hall sweep teachers.
What? You're late though.
And those teachers hold those kids who are not in class, walk them to a designated area.
Once a student has had their ID scanned for tardy, then another staff member is going to escort them to their classes. So when that happens, the students will not be walking in the hallways unattended.
What class are you going to?
English.
English. Who's your teacher?
Mr. Pincel.
Mr. Pincel. I coached cross country with him.
As far as the student-teacher relationships, a lot more of our teachers are actively engaged with the students to find out what's going on in their life. How are you doing? What's going on today? Our teachers actually spend more time than in the past talking to students.
At first, honestly, I didn't believe it would work, but it's been a massive improvement in our school. There's students like me that need to get to their class on time. It's actually more helpful now that they have the Start on Time program.
We have the highest freshman on track rate in Kelly's history, so we attribute that to the fact that they're in class.
Bye, Jimmy.
So interesting to have a look at that and to see that in the context of your school. So if you're sitting there watching this in a group, now is also a really good time just to press pause on the video and have a bit of a discussion about what were some of the strategies that you saw evident in Chicago and their effect, and maybe how could some of those strategies be used at your school. You would have seen with that video that it wasn't just about talking nicely to the students. Yes, there was quite a lot of that, what I would say, happy clappy, quite American style language, come on, you can do it, all that sort of thing, trying to gee up the students to get to school. So we had a little bit of that, but then it was backed up with, real stability, a real solid way of building relationships with students as well. You would have noticed that as they are walking those particular students to the class, they were having little incidental corridor conversations. How's it going? What's going on? And that's a brilliant opportunity for that teacher just to dig underneath perhaps why that student is late. It's also, though, was very clear that they'd established a regime that was sort of non-negotiable. If the bell rang and you weren't in class, then, especially with all that help you'd been given to get there on time, then essentially you were taken, your pass was scanned. That would happen. There was not an opportunity for negotiation. So those little nice friendly chats in the corridor, on the one hand, were friendly and they were kind and they were checking up on the students, but also they were backed up with a sort of a steal of the system, which was you will get your card scanned. There is no negotiation. So there's no point bringing up, I don't need to just take me to the class. I don't need to do this. It was just, no, this is what happens now. But I'm interested in you as a human being. So chat to me, have a talk to me, but you're going to get your card scanned and then I'm going to take you to the lesson. So I thought that was a really interesting one just to note in terms of positive language. Yes, it was very positive, but not positive at the expense of some pretty clear regulations and clear rules. This is a little positive language framework that you can start considering in terms of your classrooms, your individual classrooms, and also in terms of your school. So number one, be direct. So by that, I mean kind, but straightforward. Brilliant book out there written by Kim Scott called Radical Candor, talks about how, and this is really for adults, you should be genuinely kind to the people that you're working with, really show an interest in who they are as people, but also give direct feedback, challenge them directly. So that directness is important. Don't skirt around the edges, say what you mean. So instead of look at how nicely Amy and Tracy are working, that's a sort of a maybe manipulative way of let's point out 2 other people in the classroom who are being really good. So what are you doing? There's this implied statement underneath that, which is, so you should be working better. So rather than being manipulative, just be direct. Just say, John, Ahmed, and Yusuf, you need to focus on your work now. You're trying to test my patience. Why do you always get into fights at recess? Straight away, Mohammed, recess seems to be a difficult time for you. Explain to me why. So you're being direct, but you're also being kind. And Samantha, primary students can speak better than you. Again, manipulative, trying to make Samantha feel shame that she's not acting her age. Could be, Samantha, make sure you're using friendly language to your peers. Just be direct. Tell them what you really need. So that sort of positive language, rather than trying to be manipulative, is really important when you're working with students. Second positive language framework is convey faith in the student. And I know this is another technique from Bill Rogers. If you've watched my in-class learning strategies, it draws a lot of what Bill Rogers says. He also talks about take-up time, which is a similar sort of thing. Making sure that you believe that the students are going to do the right thing, especially after you've issued them some sort of instruction. So instead of Shayna, don't even think about copying your friend's work. So you're assuming she's going to do the wrong thing. Say, Shayna, you've got this. I know you can do really well in this task. Using your language to show that you have faith in these students, rather than always using your language in a way which is predicting their failure, predicting something's going to go wrong. That's definitely a one, I think, personally speaking, that I needed to monitor when I was in the class. If I was starting to get annoyed at a particular student, I'd be saying things like, you always talk when we have guest speakers. Don't do it again today, please, because I was feeling that stress. So, try and turn that in. If you find yourself about to say something like that, try and turn it into something a bit more positive. Like, I know you've been working on your focus and you'll be able to practice that in this afternoon's talk. So really try and work on that going forward. The third thing of this positive language framework is focus on their actions. So make sure you're clear about what you want the student to do. Sometimes when we're, instructing a student, we'll get a little bit too focused on their intention and these more complex things. And again, Bill Rogers said, just focus on that moment. What's important in that moment? Focus on their actions. So instead of you're being really annoying, David, be focused on the actions. Tapping your pencil constantly is distracting people in the class, David. Be direct, but focus on actually what's happening, not on the feeling that perhaps that student is giving you at the time. And keep it brief. That's what I'm trying to do today, but students don't want some massive lecture about why their behavior is wrong and bad. Most of the time they know what they're doing is wrong actually at the time. They don't want to be reminded of everything that happened. Say to them right now, you need to ensure that your behavior is aligned with our school's values. You don't need to tell them about how it hasn't been in the past. You don't need to give them a whole lecture because they'll just stop listening. So keeping it brief is important. And talking of listening, that's the last one. Listen. Know when to be silent and listen to the student. And again, watching a lot of lessons in my time as a DP and also working with many, many different schools across New South Wales and Victoria, I think this is often one of the issues that a teacher feels, especially when you have somebody in observing a lesson, a teacher feels that they need to constantly take control and dominate a lesson and talk a lot, and actually is much more impressive, much better for student-teacher relationships to show that you're able to listen to students, that you actually can really sit back and hear them. So make sure you can also help some other things, help students envision success, help students use language that shows that they will be successful. You could also use reminding language. Get students to actively remind themselves. Don't just tell them what to do. It's interesting, that one, because then you could say, well, isn't that a bit manipulative? A bit like the first example when you're trying to manipulate them, not being direct. So I take that point. I think that's a good point. It'd be about monitoring that and not reminding them in a manipulative sort of way. And of course, then there's reinforcing language. So make sure you're praising, especially for those year 7, year 8 kids, praising them, telling them what they're doing really, really well in that positive sort of way. So they're the 5 key points, the framework for positive language. Be direct, convey faith in the student, focus on the actions, keep it brief, and listen. Listening, of course, you might think, well, that's not using language, but that's why I put that point about just help them to express themselves to you by being positive, by helping them to reinforce what they're doing is right. Again, if you're with a group, if you're not, just reflect on that for a little bit and think about definitely, how am I doing this in the lesson right now? How am I going to monitor myself as I'm teaching that I'm using some of these strategies? Do I need to perhaps just print out that slide and think to myself, take a screenshot now and think to myself, in a lesson, I'm just going to have this maybe in my top drawer of my desk to keep reminding, what are some of these positive language filters that I need to use to build up the relationships with these students? Obviously, these sorts of ideas, these sorts of understandings go hand in hand with the other little videos that I've made about restorative practices. Obviously, you're using a lot of positive language when you're having those restorative conversations, and those in-class strategies when, as I mentioned, you're using take-up time and those sorts of strategies that Bill Rogers would recommend. That's all based around a positive teacher-student relationship. So positive language feeds into that relationship. Think about assessing yourself, monitoring your own use of language. Perhaps you want to do a peer observation with a trusted colleague at school, where you drop into their lesson for 15 minutes and just note down perhaps some really good positive language they're using, or if something pops out as not being that positive, just note it down and mention it to your colleague. Often we do this stuff because we're trained in it. We've been doing it for many, many years. It just comes out naturally. So it's not a bad thing just to have somebody watch you and point out a couple of things that perhaps you've been doing habitually that you haven't noticed. And remember, the better we get as a staff together, the better students will also get at being positive and speaking more constructively. So if we're modeling this sort of behavior all the time, they will start repeating it. Again, I noticed my son, where they do a lot of work in this in primary schools, I noticed my son using positive language to me because it's obviously been really hammered into him at his school, which is fantastic. And correcting us and making sure us as parents are staying positive and speaking in appropriate sorts of ways. It's all about modeling these skills for our students. That's the most important thing. Thanks very much. I've been Suleiman Charles Neve for Education Changemakers, and happy teaching.